A little bit more information about how to add value to your self-portrait. I noticed a lot of the same kind of confusion or same issues that people were running into. So I just want to quickly go step by step and then kind of talk about some of the most common mistakes and how to fix them, right? So the first thing I would do with your portrait is give it an outline. And you're outlining basically the major contours of the face. So the outside of the face, outside of the jaw, outside of the shirts, and then any major kind of landmarks in your face. So especially if you're smiling, you're probably going to have these lines here. Your eyes might have some crinkles, and your ears have this definition. So I'm going to start by outlining things that I think are significant, right? A common thing that people do is they're not very cautious with their outline. They don't take their time on it and kind of just are as long as it's close enough, but that's not what's going to make it look like you. If you are just doing kind of some haphazard lines that don't really follow the contours of your face, it's not going to look like you in the end. So you do want to be pretty precise with your line work, okay? After your line work, now you have to start thinking about value. So remember, in this project, I'm looking for a few things. I'm looking for solid areas of black, solid areas of white, and some values or grays in between. Now, if I was just messing around in Photoshop, what you can do is actually, it's called posterize, and it does this for you. So if I take it down to 2 levels, it does purely black and white, which is kind of terrifying, right? If I do 3, it gives me 1 gray in between. And then I can keep working my way up, and the more levels I have, the more values I have, right? So in yours, I'm looking for like 4 or 5 values. So let's do a 5. And this breaks it up pretty easily for me to see, right? My darkest shadows are in the eyes, around the lips, under the chin, and they get darker as they kind of go back into space, right? My highlights are over here on the nose, some on the cheek and teeth. The problem is I'm making you guys practice that just by hand. So if you wanted to pull it into Photoshop, you could just to see it, but I'm trying to train your eyes to capture those shadows by themselves, right? So if we go over here, here are the techniques that I have to choose from. So hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, or a loose line. Now, whichever one you use is totally up to you. It doesn't matter, but you do have to get a range, right? So I'm looking from darks clear to white. So what I personally start to do is I will look for where are my darkest shadows, and I will outline those. So I'd say, okay, kind of through here, there's a really dark shadow. That's going to be a solid black area. And it's going to be a little bit easier to do this with Sharpie rather than in Photoshop. There's kind of a really dark shadow that kind of runs through here. So that could be solid black. His eyes, he kind of shuts his eyes when he smiles. So those are just solid black. Let's say kind of throughout this side there's black. And I'm going to go through and do that for my entire portrait, right? Some of you might have a hard time doing that. The lights in my classroom are pretty diffused, so it'll be really hard to see. There's not very much contrast. So you can either exaggerate some of your shadows, or what you can do is say, well, I'm going to pretend that there is a light source over here. So essentially down the middle of my face, this half's going to be in light, and this half's going to be in shadow. So towards the farthest edge of my face, it might be solid black, and I would shade that in solid black. So that's your choice as an artist. If you want to go that route, you totally can. You are not bound by what you see in the photograph, right? So after you've decided your darkest areas, the next thing that I like to do is kind of be aware of where are my highlights, where are the lightest areas in my face. So in this case, I'll outline them really quick and then undo it. There's a pretty big highlight. And again, you want to be pretty specific to the shape. The more specific you are, the more it's going to look like you. There's highlights in the ear. There's a highlight. So again, as specific as you can get, like this one, I probably could have been way more specific. Comes clear down to the eyebrow. So now that I'm aware of where my highlights are and where my shadows are, I know that everything else needs to be a value. So it really should have quite a bit of shading technique by the time you're done with it, right? So if I go back to my example, I like to use hatching. So let's say I'm going to start hatching this entire space, and I'm going to go in this direction. That's one value that I've got so far. And remember, I'm looking for a range. So 1 is not going to be good enough. I'm just going to go really quick. But you'll notice I stopped at the highlight, right? Now I could even go back and add some more lines to kind of blend it from the black to the lighter areas. I could start to do some cross hatching, some cross contours. The more shading you have, the better it's going to turn out in the end. And the more you blend it from dark to light, the better it's going to look. So really take your time getting that range of values, because that's what's going to make it look like it has form, right? I could zoom in. Let's do this on the eye. And again, I can still just go in and add that value. Remember, the closer the lines are together, the darker it's going to look. And the more they're spread out, so this starts off really dark and then kind of trails out, right? So there's a gradient just by itself. A mistake that I see a lot of people make is they don't really have very much value or contrast. So they might have a tiny bit of a shadow right here, and then they add a tiny bit of shading, but that doesn't really make it look like it's 3D. It kind of starts to just look like you have a spot of something right there. Or they'll go in and add a couple lines right there. That doesn't achieve a value effect. It just looks like some weird lines on your face. So the more you do, the better off it's going to look like in the end. Another common mistake I see is when people do cross-hatching, they space their lines really far apart. And again, that doesn't really look like value. It just looks like a plaid pattern. So you want to make sure your lines are close enough together that they achieve a value from afar instead of just looking like you drew a pattern on top of the face.